Kick off today with Amena Bakr in respect of International Women's Day. My five sisters wouldn't forgive me if I didn't acknowledge Amena Bakr, I think the region's leading OPEC correspondent and Deputy Bureau Chief of Energy Intelligence. Amena, good morning and welcome to the table. I was planning to kick off by inviting you to talk about the OPEC meeting last week, which we will get to, but I think I'd just like to deal with the news of the day. Overnight, we saw once again some attacks on Saudi oil facilities, and I'm wondering if you could bring us up to speed exactly what's happened and what's the outcome.
Hi, good morning, Sean, and happy Women's Day to all the women watching us now. Yes, as you said, that there was an attack yesterday, unfortunately, again, on two of the Aramco facilities. The first one was in Ras Tanura, and the second attack happened in Dahran. We saw a statement from the Saudi Energy Ministry confirming that the attack had happened by the Houthi rebels once more. And they also said that there was no damage to any of the facilities. The attack in Ras Tanura was basically on a petroleum oil tank. And in Dahran, it seems that there was a landing of a lot of debris from the ballistic missiles. So I know quite a number of people there. They said in the camps there was a lot of debris. One of the roads, the old Abqaiq road, was shut down because of the debris. But no injuries reported, no damage to facilities. So that's the good news. And of course, you've seen the reaction of Brent going above $70. This is not just because of the OPEC deal or the surprise that Saudi Arabia managed to pull off again. It's also because of this heightened geopolitical tension that we're seeing in the region. And this is not last week also we had the Houthis claiming attacks in a facility in Jeddah. This was not confirmed by anybody in Saudi Arabia, but we're seeing a pattern here and a repetition of these attacks.
Omar Najia, Global Head of Derivatives, BB Energy. Omar, good morning. I suspect we might have gone through $70 this morning, regardless of developments in Saudi Arabia. Your thoughts on the OPEC decision last week?
Yeah, I think basically it's always interesting how people want to make sense of a price rise by adding it to a kind of story. And actually what Amena was talking about is very interesting because, I mean, I don't have any friends on the ground in Saudi Arabia, but I looked at the internet and I clearly saw several missiles coming down and exploding in quite large explosions. And in all my trading days, Aramco, Kuwait Petroleum, everybody, Bahrain, everybody in the Middle East, whenever there's a massive disaster, they always say, nothing's happened, everything's okay. And 2-3 days later, you see basically, I mean, even the last attack on Aramco, it was like, nothing's happened, everything's okay. And a day later, they say, well, actually, it's quite a big disaster, blah, blah. So the market, I don't think, believes them to a large extent. But again, I think basically momentum is to the upside. Everybody who was expecting, Iran and the US to meet and more oil and all this kind of stuff, all the OPEC analysts saying, they will look at the price and they will say, wow, it's really high and all this kind of stuff. I was trying to explain that it's all about relative values. Don't look at the price of Brent on its own, look at it against something else. Case in point, look at the equity markets. Equity markets are coming off. Last week, it was equity markets are going up because Biden is, past the 1.9 trillion, blah, blah, blah. Well, if that's the case, why are they coming off now? So it's interesting, but basically, we think momentum's to the upside. We are bullish. Everything doesn't go up in a straight line. You have corrections, all the rest of it. US dollar, I think now has found that low. The euros started to really move to the downside. It got to 119 last week. Our target is 116. I think it's going to, and nobody's actually talking about that now, dollar strength. So it'll be very interesting to see further forwards what news story gets put on this.
Well, $70 oil and dollar strength, you would think, has some bearing on Asian or emerging market consumer demand. Let's get back to that and bring in Tony Quinn, CEO of Tankbank International. Tony, your thoughts on the news overnight? Anytime you have missiles raining in on the world's biggest oil infrastructure, you'd probably expect oil prices to pop a little more than they are. This is a vulnerable infrastructure that has a few choke points. You know, the majority of Saudi exports go out of Ras Tanura. The majority of its oil storage, 33 million barrels, is in Ras Tanura, etc. Your thoughts, Tony?
Hi, and good morning, everyone in Dubai. Good afternoon, anyone in Asia, and very, very early good morning to anyone in the UK. The picture behind me, you might remember, is Singapore. For those of you who never travel anymore, I thought I'd put that up just to annoy you. I did a 10K walk with my friends, including Leo Tamaris this morning. Clearly, we wanted to talk about the oil market, but the fact it was 33 degrees and sunny, and we walked along the beach, I had to take the picture just to wind everyone up.
Yeah,
so
well, we do
anyway.
Appreciate that. We do.
So let's get back to in terms
Next time
of,
I want a photo of you standing on the top of that building up there on with a
NBS.
sundowner in your hand.
I can do that for you. I can do that for you. No problem at all. No, I agree with Omar. As he said earlier on, you know, we heard this before. You know, you have the tax coming in, the attacks come in, and you know everything is fine. And he's quite right. You know, then we hear 3 or 4 days later there's some big damage or whatever. I think the market's gone beyond that. I think they don't really listen to that, because even if you do have an issue with infrastructure, particularly tank infrastructure is pretty strong. It doesn't take too much to put things back on the ground again, which we've seen before. So, you know, my view really there is, you know, that's not what it's all about. It's usually the market sentiment. You know, my old story, as I've always said all along, I'm the $40 oil man. And if you look at the market, I looked at oilprice.com just before I came on, just looked at their graphs. If you look at Brent averages 48 for the last 5 years. That's the average number. You know, okay, we're sitting on the just above 70. It probably will go back to 80. I mean, that's probably about the highest it will probably get to, and then we'll see the decline back down. It'll just be enough to get some of the American infrastructure back into action again, and then it's time to close it down again. It's the old story, right? So I don't think anything's ever changed. But like Omar, I sort of think that, you know, you can have a missile here and a missile there. I mean, just look at the Israelis, how many missiles have flown backwards between them and Gaza over the last few years. And the nearest thing to Gaza is the biggest oil terminal in Israel. They're not going to tell you anytime soon there's going to be a big problem there. And I know there hasn't been, because I've worked with those guys a lot. But, you know, these things really, tank infrastructure particularly, is easily fixed and easily put back on the ground very quickly. And usually you find, particularly in a refinery, there's probably about 35% of the tanks that are empty anyway. So the likelihood is they might hit an empty. And if they don't, they can quickly transfer to another facility. So it's not as dangerous as it sounds. And I think certainly in the context of infrastructure, it can be built back pretty quickly.
Well, I suppose the big question, Amena, is really about escalation. This is following a similar trend that we saw in 2019. The first report a few weeks ago of a ship off the coast of the Gulf of Oman, an Israeli flagship. It was a container, a little bit of an episode. And now a few weeks later, we've something escalating to this. I mean, where it could go next, I suppose, ultimately nobody knows. But Amena, let's go back to last week and Saudi Arabia's decision and OPEC Plus decision to roll over essentially without any increase in supply. That was a surprise to the market, clearly a shock. Everybody was expecting an increase for April. Should have we been surprised? Did we not listen to Prince Abdulaziz, who clearly stated the week or two before that we had to approach this with extreme caution?
Well, it was a little bit of a surprise, Sean, basically because even OPEC's internal reports, which we managed to have a look at, indicated that the market was tight. The market was in need of more supply. In their assessments, they said the market needs 1.4 million barrels in April, and then another 500 in May, and another 400 in June. So the expectation was that there's going to be some form of easing, but a day before the meeting, where it seemed it was at the JMMC, and it seemed Saudi Arabia was quite determined on not adding any barrels. Then we've started hearing voices saying, okay, there might be a compromise. Russia still wants an exemption, and that's what we saw. We saw Kazakhstan and Russia again getting exempt. They've been allowed to increase their production, while the remainder of the group is rolling over the cuts. And it's to some degree also Saudi Arabia taking back control. And perhaps this is the price of the control they're taking back. They offered to extend that million barrel voluntary cut for another month. So by April, I mean, the growing expectation now in the market is there is going to be some kind of easing, but all our expectations ahead of meetings tend to be wrong. Now my tip...
Given that point, that the expectation was, as everybody had in our survey, only 4% had predicted the outcome. Were other OPEC plus countries similarly surprised? I mean, is this a case of Saudi leading and everybody following, or is there an active dialogue on next steps?
Well, at the meeting, things went very smoothly. The atmosphere was described to me as very calm, meaning that these countries perhaps had prior communication with the Saudis on that front, and everybody agreed very easily to the Saudi strategy of being cautious and not flooding the market, and saying that these prices are not necessarily based on fundamentals. So they chose to go along with the cautious approach.
Omar, looking at the technicals of this sort of price move now above $70, WTI still not above 70 yet, but in the high 60s. What does the technicals tell us as to where the resistance is and where the travel might go?
Next resistance, I don't really like Brent that much. Next resistance on WTI is 76 and change, basically. So it went above 65. Next resistance is 76. It's going to get there. Technicals are bullish. That low, by getting above 65, you've actually confirmed that low. Depends which one you want to look at, the NYMEX or whichever, or you ignore the squeeze that happened. But yeah, I think basically the market's going to head above $76 on WTI. The other important point, I think, is ask yourself, I mean, if I was OPEC and everybody's talking to me about green and the end of oil and, we don't need pollution and we don't need oil and we're all going to change and whatever, that makes me have two options. One, push prices so I can make some money. Two, keep prices low so I can go extinct. So for me, it's a little bit, I mean, it's a no-brainer, surely. If basically you're being told day by day that oil is going to become obsolete, disappear, all the rest of it, then what are you doing if you want to keep prices low? And what's the point? I don't get it.
Well, you keep prices low, so it discourages the investment into alternative energy, and you keep your oil competitive. I mean, look at India now. We interviewed the spokesperson for the ruling party last week, and he said at these prices, our decision making will be more into nuclear, more into alternative energy rather than oil and fossil fuels.
The problem is that India basically doesn't have a problem with high oil prices, has a problem with high product prices, because some people own refineries and basically they're allowed to make massive margins. So India doesn't have a problem with oil prices. Some rich people have a problem with the government, and the government doesn't want to really talk about it, etc., etc. The other point about investment is now in Europe and the States, it's gone beyond that. There is no need to basically push prices or keep prices high or keep prices low in order to encourage investment. That investment is coming and happening no matter what. It's a dogma now. It's basically invest in green. Green is the future. Oil is dead. It's got nothing to do with any kind of analysis. That's the whole point. It's to do with dogma. This is the way we're going. And I understand it, and I think basically most people understand it, and I'm 100% sure that OPEC understand it as well.
So I maximize your revenue now until such time as there's no more revenue, I suppose. Let's just go to China, Tony. We're starting the week in Asia after the big meeting of the leadership of the Communist Party in China, with announcements of a minimum of 6% growth in 2021. Any other indicators to take away from the Chinese meeting that you would pick up on to guide us going forward?
Well, unfortunately, as not a member of the Communist Party in China, I never got invited to that meeting. It would have been good to be a fly on the wall, but my Mandarin isn't quite up to scratch, so that wouldn't have worked either. No, I think what we've seen, the Asia pick up in the first part of this year, they were buying freely and happily. Now, when we get to the 70 marks, it'll slow a little bit, but there's plenty of stock out there. They've got plenty of product in tank, and there's still plenty floating around as well from the older, lower price days. So there's still a market there. It was interesting. I was reading one of the comments there. I think Ted put a comment on your chat line there a little while ago about where the prices were going, and so they pumped the price up to Asia and they dropped the price. I think he said there was a 250 increase on I'm trying to remember this now, on Asian crude moving out. And
Saudi raised the price to
right.
Asia.
Aramco pushed it up, but when it goes to the Med, it goes down because they know that the Med is a mature market, and that's the problem. They're not going to sell it there. There's too much competition. There's too many old refineries trying to just kill themselves by selling things low. Whereas out here, there's still an active market. There's still an active buying scene, and then China is obviously a major part of that. And the infrastructure in Singapore is also a major part of that, because this is where it sort of parks before it moves on in the majority of cases, not particularly in crude, but certainly in products. So
at these prices, Tony, we had the Saudi minister last week tell the Indian customers, draw down from your inventories if you want cheaper prices, because you've stored a lot of oil there last year. Is that a reasonable point to make? And do you expect that drawdown to accelerate in Asia?
Look, I don't expect the Chinese government will listen to any of that at all, because they'll do what they want. Very much probably the same as the American government would think the same way, a year ago. So I don't think it's going to be the huge impact. I think they'll go on buying. They'll buy more cautiously at the higher price, but they'll still continue buying. There's a massive demand and a growing demand, and the whole of Southeast Asia needs oil. So we're still the only developing and growing area of the world. So it has to come this way. So putting the prices up, not great idea by the Saudis, but I can understand it as Omar just said, might as well go up rather than go down. Why lose money? Let's try and make money while the sun is shining.
Well, I suppose ultimately the economists would say that in a fragile economic recovery, we've never had $70 oil before, Amena, when we've had 8 million barrels of idle capacity. So that's kind of a new departure. Amena, on the guidance from the Saudis regarding their infamous 1 million barrels a day of unilateral cut, they said they were going to hold it for April. Is there any insight as when and how they will release it thereafter?
Well, they said that it won't be released all at once. It won't come back in 1 month. It would be more of a gradual process, but they also highlighted that this is a sovereign decision, and anything related to that voluntary cut is a decision made by the leadership. And Sean, we've seen this decision. I mean, it changes overnight, and it changes on short term. And Aramco itself is notified in very, very short term basis. So this is something that can change between one day or the other, or like just a few hours before the meeting, or even during the meeting.
What's the guidance to the rest of OPEC that, listen, we're going to do this, we're not going to tell you about it, we'll lease a few barrels here and there? They don't have an obligation as such in which to keep OPEC Plus informed about when this 1 million returns.
No, because again, this is a voluntary cut in addition to the cuts they already have. And the minister got asked about whether or not Saudi Arabia will be increasing exports, because the deal is basically based on production and not exports. So easily they could draw from stocks and export. And he said that they had built Saudi Arabia built the credibility of, once it says that it will cut a certain amount, it will deliver on that. And the world does know that. So he doesn't want any kind of questioning around the credibility of Saudi Arabia. And I have to say, over the years, they have the few countries that do keep their word.
Well, certainly they have done, they've surprised continuously. In January, the cut announced, now the surprise that it wasn't coming back. And it seems Prince Abdulaziz is determined to keep that surprise tool in his pocket. Let's go to the survey question to have a view from the room on the outlook of this current tensions we're seeing in the region. As I referenced earlier, when this happened most recently in 2019, it continued to escalate over a number of incidents. If there was a geopolitical analyst on this call, I'm sure they would say something like, this is part of the Iran-US rapprochement of some description, feeling each other out. Nonetheless, what is the expectation of the room for this to get worse before it gets better, and in so doing actually disrupt oil flow? Omar, looking forward to the sort of week ahead, early doors out of Asia, markets popped up a little bit, but nothing dramatic given what's happened. Most of the jump we had last week, would you expect there to be a bit of a tapering off this week?
Yeah, I think basically market needs to correct a little bit, but I think again the push is going to be higher. So I think in the push higher, we're basically maybe halfway to the upside. Halfway means in terms of time before we get to the next high, before we get to basically targets around $80 WTI, etc., etc. So in a few months, basically. But yes, I think higher we go. I think corrections are to be bought, we will be interesting to see. But at the end of the day, the stuff about tensions in the Gulf, the US and Iran, it's a very simple dynamic, but some people basically just refuse to accept it. The US has to go back into the deal with no preconditions, zero. Live up to all their commitments, and then Iran will basically, do what they have been doing, which is basically complying with the letter of the agreement. So anything that the US, EU, they want to try bring these people in or those people in or whatever, or talk about missiles, it's just not going to work. So the question is, if the US insists on this approach, then we're heading to a very bad place. If the US basically swallows hard and says, okay, we were wrong, we broke our word, we walked out of a signed agreement, etc., 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 and eats crow by the bucketful, then yeah, Iran will basically comply. But to expect that somehow the Iranians are stupid or silly or can't see that, it's a very black and white issue. They will stand their ground. They have been standing their ground since 1979. Expectations that basically, the Europeans will offer them this or whatever. We've all seen European word in terms of, in the view of Iran is absolutely worthless. The US word on a signed agreement vis-a-vis Iran is absolutely worthless. These are not stupid people. I would do the same. You would do the same. Anybody would do the same. So either the US gets a moment of clarity, or we're heading to more tensions. It's very simple.
Well, I suppose it would seem on that sort of diagnosis that it's very difficult for the US president to concede this early in his presidency. So this may get worse before it gets better. Let's see if the survey result does deliver that outcome. Yes, but not by a big margin. Tony, Meanwhile, back at the ranch, things in China are also getting a little bit tense. We have a few stories in our digest today around the Chinese sort of demanding that the Americans reverse the position of Trump on Taiwan. And also there's this story that's bubbling along and seems to be coming more and more with the Microsoft cyber attack. Tensions in China, US were a big feature of the Trump administration. Doesn't look like they're getting any better yet, at least.
No, and I don't think that they're going to get better any time in the next, couple of months or anything like that. But I think actually the Biden administration is going to help. It's going to help with that relationship. It's going to try and improve the dialogue, but it has to do it in the right way. The Americans never want to stand down on anything. The Chinese are pacifists. They don't want to start something. So, you've got a basis there for a good relationship. And I suppose on a parity with that, rather like Omar was just saying, if you look at the Iranian situation, which is comparable in a sense, there's still this anti-American Iranian and anti-American Chinese thing going on. But if you go back to 1968, the biggest piece of infrastructure in the Mediterranean was actually built by the Iranians and the Israelis as a joint venture. So if you start thinking about that, and then you realize then that Mark Rich came in from America and actually created this very small company called Glencore out of the whole thing. And then you suddenly realize these things come and go. Relationships come, they go, they come, they go. So I think we've had this, this downturn in the relationship with the US and China. I think we're going to see it get better, my view, because the US needs China. The customer base is Asia and China is the biggest consumer here. So it makes no sense at all for this sort of sentiment to go awry as it did over the last 4 years. And I'm not politically party one way or the other, but it was out of control and it was let get out of control. Now let's hope, because we don't know, that they can bring it back into control and get some normality back.
Well, I suppose the challenge there begin, with the new administration finding their feet, they have to be able to save, hold the line, if you like, from the point of view of not being perceived too early as a pushover. Amena, where do we think OPEC Plus goes? These monthly meetings now will continue. The next one, I believe, is only a few weeks away. What are the indicators that will guide this OPEC Plus decision? If you signaled that the internal report from OPEC was already that the market in Q2 was looking for more oil, what does Saudi Arabia and others need to see in order for them to sort of make that next step of increasing supply?
For the Saudis, I think, Sean, they're looking for more evidence in terms of the fundamentals backing up the prices. They're worried about putting back supply in the market and seeing a drop where they can't control it anymore. So they would rather overcorrect than undercorrect. But with overcorrecting, of course, there is the risk of overheating this market, which was a question again posed to Prince Abdulaziz, and he said that he's not worried about the market overheating because of the fact that they have monthly meetings and they can adjust quite quickly. So this is, and I half jokingly said yesterday that whatever you think OPEC is going to decide, think the exact opposite, and that's probably what's going to happen.
Well, in that regard, Amena, we've been talking on this program a few times in the last week or so about this strategy of what was a strategy of complete transparency and predictability on the OPEC Plus roadmap is now one that is completely cloistered and continues to surprise. Should we expect that to be the strategy continuing?
I think this is the strategy of the current energy minister. This is part of his character. This is it's new, and this is his way of managing the current situation, which the current situation is full of surprises. Nobody expected this pandemic. Nobody expected oil prices to go to negative. So with that, they counter that with surprising the market. So I think for the time being, yes, that's what we will be facing.
expect the unexpected. Well, we wrap it up there with Brent trading up nearly 2%. Same with NYMEX holding above $70 in Asia. The equity markets looking a little soft in Asia this morning, but nothing, well, Hang Seng's down 1.5%. So maybe equities are looking at potential for inflation. Who knows? But oil has its bounce. Will it hold it through the week? We'll have to wait and see. Please join us every morning at 10:30 UAE time. Until then, thank you so much, Amena, as always. Omar, great to have you. And Tony, next time we want you on top of that building with the little, celebrating Women's Day, International Women's Day at the top there with your favorite women, whoever they may be.
Oh, really?
Tony,
I'll do my best.
Yes. Amena, again, happy International Women's Day. Omar, thank you so much. All the best, everybody.
Happy Women's Day to all the ladies out there.